think if we can get behind the root of the problem and help with our kids and our own expectations of life.
So, how can we teach ourselves and our kids to suffer well? I mean, you've touched on it by just acknowledging that something bad could happen. Talk a
Mhm.
little more about that.
I think one of the things I one of the other parts of this that I see happening across culture, but in a lot of the younger generations, but also in my generation, is I think we do a little bit too much like internal interrogation. This is again the pendulum swinging, like, it's very trendy now, the whole mindfulness, meditation kind of space. And I think part of that is, like I said, the pendulum switching. My parents were not of a generation that talked about how they were feeling emotionally.
Mhm.
And I think some of that was very unhealthy. But I think we've taken it a little too far in the other direction because the
Mm.
more time you spend interrogating how you feel from
Mhm.
moment to moment, um, I think the study that we mentioned at the top of our conversation is evidence that that can veer into a really unhealthy place.
Mm.
So I think knowing yourself is good. There's biblical instruction for knowing yourself, for taking thoughts captive, for, orienting yourself towards walking in the ways of the Lord. I
Mhm.
was just reading Psalm 25. Teach me your ways, show me your path so that I can walk in truth. I mean, so we're supposed to be intentional about where our minds are and where our feet are going. At the same time, how you're feeling from moment to moment is not as important as we act like it is, I think sometimes. And so, I think just getting out of your own head, which is easier said than done,
Yeah.
but and doing the same with our kids, not constantly interrogating how they're feeling, and also not allowing their feeling to dictate how we respond to them. I read
Mm.
this really fascinating book a couple months ago by this Dutch sociologist, and it was called Between Us. And she was studying how emotions differ across cultures. And I didn't agree with all of her conclusions, but one of the fascinating things she found was that there are there the conventional wisdom in this kind of research has been that there are a handful of innate human emotions that everyone across time and culture have experienced, but maybe we just express them differently or talk about them differently. But she actually found that your circumstances can also influence your inner experiences. And she gave this example of, let's say you have a child who is in the grocery store with his mom. He asks for a treat. She says no, and he throws a fit.
Mhm.
And if the mom, says, "Oh my gosh, here's your treat," or if the mom says, "Okay, we have to leave because you're being so loud." Those are two options. The third option is for the mom to say, "Stop it right now," and
Mm.
to, do that. Now, the first time she says that, as any mom knows, that's probably not going to work, and it
Not
might
be
not
too
work for several
effective. Yeah.
times.
Yeah.
But eventually, most children grow out of throwing tantrums. And what researchers have found when it comes to emotions is that not only are kids in this example, and then you can extrapolate this, not only are they learning to modulate their behavior, but they actually get less angry. That's the
Mm.
important insight there, which is that we actually have more control over our inner experiences and our behavior than we are taught.
Mm.
And, Alisa, I think about this all of the time when we talk about transgenderism, because
Mm.
you'll hear people say, um, if we don't allow, kids or people to do this to their bodies, to have these surgeries, to take these hormones, they will kill themselves. They will commit suicide. They will self harm. And that is a kind of devastating, like, white flag that we have no business waving, because
Mm.
you can you can tell someone who is deeply, profoundly struggling mentally and emotionally, don't hurt yourself. And you can
Right.
help that person get to a place where they won't. Nothing is inevitable. Our
Mhm.
behaviors are not inevitable. You get to decide what you wanna do. I mean, there's one of the core tenets of this OCD therapy is living according to your values, by which they mean, okay, let's say you're really, really afraid of germs. You don't wanna go out in public because you're afraid you'll touch germs. Do you still wanna work? Do you
Mhm.
want to function? Do you wanna go outside? Then you're just gonna have to do it.
Yeah.
And the blessing of it is the more you do it, it teaches that lizard part of your brain that panics that it doesn't need to panic anymore, and it stops. I mean,
Yeah.
there's data. Like, this
Wow.
happens.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really cool. So as we kinda come to a close here, obviously you mentioned transgenderism. We're in a really chaotic time in our culture. How do you think developing resilience for ourselves and our kids, can maybe help solve some of this chaos?
Well, I think if we can get behind the root of the problem and help with our kids and our own expectations of life. This is where reading the scriptures, reading the stories of the saints, like you brought up, the
Mhm.
early church and the way even the way modern Christians in countries like China and India and Myanmar and these places under really strict persecution, the way that they are bearing up underneath it. Um, if we can change expectations and we can make it seem like less of an emergency when we encounter disappointment, discouragement, moderate danger, pain. If we can sort of, as parents, if we can grit our teeth and let our kids experience those things, within obviously certain limits, and help them through them, but not try to protect them from all of those, um, then I think the psychological community hopefully can get back to its roots of treating the mind as opposed to treating the body in service to
Mm,
the mind,
mm.
'cause that's not how
Yep,
reality works, and it's
right.
not gonna help anybody. Um, but I think it's gonna require more and more of that because unfortunately, when it comes to things like sexuality in particular and gender, the more we go down this path, we're just gonna have more and more, victims of this.
Mhm.
And eventually it's gonna turn back over and we're gonna realize that this never helped anybody. And
Yeah,
telling people that, this sort of safetyism and, never encountering or learning how to cope with difficult sensations or feelings or ideas, is what you need. The more we can, squash that message, the healthier we'll get. And I think we'll have to.
mhm.
Otherwise, I don't see the lawsuits are already starting when it comes to that sort of thing.
Oh,
And
yeah, we're
and
seeing all the
I'm really
detransition
hopeful.
stories and
Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So and I think the church has a this is where the church can shine because we're
Mhm,
not afraid of suffering. We shouldn't be afraid of dying. No, I'm afraid of I'm not afraid of death. I'm afraid of dying because I don't like to be uncomfortable and encounter pain. I
yeah,
I feel totally comfortable saying that. At the same time, I know that our future glory will not compare with whatever suffering we encounter here. I know that Jesus encountered more suffering than I will, and he remained faithful to the gospel and to his Father, and that's really all I need to know.
yeah,
I still, struggle and feel sad and anxious sometimes, and I think that's going to be a part of life until we get to be with him. But it's not an emergency, and we were made with the ability to cope with it alongside
yeah.
him.